Is Anthony. I got really lucky. I received the John Journey Traveling Fellowship, and so something that we all have in common is John Journey gave us some money, and so I wanted to really see it for myself, and I also had these ideas about what was really still relevant. And so as I went there, a lot of the ideas developed. I had somewhat of an idea of what I wanted to study, but it was really not until I got there that I really started to dig into everything that there was for me to see and to experience. And so, you know, I feel kind of strange lecturing you because you're all architects, you know way more than me. And so what I'm sharing now is just some photos and some pages that I've torn straight from my sketchbook. Sometimes the writing gets just a little personal, but I don't think you'll mind. But it's really just the way that I was able to see Brazil through my eyes as an architecture student. I just graduated from USC, and my commitment was to go down there, and the only thing I knew for sure was that I was going to try to record all of this stuff in my sketchbook. And so, again, I didn't have much experience. I didn't really speak Portuguese, but I did have somewhat of an experience with sketchbooking, and I did know that at least it was my commitment to record and observe everything that I could. I had somewhat of an appetite just to go and to draw, just to go and to experience. I didn't know anybody except Michael Carroll, and so I started in the city of Guarujá. And it took me all over parts of Brazil, and highs and lows. I got to meet Oscar Niemeyer, which was part of kind of a dream, and everything in between kind of is combined in the pages of these sketchbooks that record my journey. And so again, some of it's just a personal story, and I'd like to tell some of those stories. Other parts are things that I've really think I've learned a lot from these cities, and the Brazilian culture and the Brazilian landscape and the Brazilian way of life. It all comes together in a very unique way, so that if you're a learner committed at all to observing, whether you're an architect or a sociologist, there's a lot to be seen, a lot to be learned. And so here's just some categories of some of the observations. This is just kind of my introduction, showing some photos and some sketches. I'll go into the three major cities. I'll go back for a second. I lived for a month in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, and in Brasilia. And all of those cities have such different identities, and that's one thing that I really started to pick up on. And kind of beneath all of this was this idea that I'd been reading about and thinking about monuments versus everyday architecture, and how some monuments might age over time in a different way, and how monuments and non-monuments might accumulate meaning in different ways. And I knew that I was investing in a really intense, I was going to witness an intense culture of modernism, but I was also interested in some of the new architecture from the young architects. And I just have to also say that it was a very spiritual journey too. A lot's happening in Brazil spiritually, and I interacted with people of all different races. It's very international, and that really started to make certain ideas that I had recede to the background, and certain ideas really come to the foreground. And so I'd just like to share some pages. So these are the three cities. Sao Paulo, the powerful kind of burly city. Rio, the violent city where architecture and landscape really collide. And then Brasilia, the utopian city of modernism. And so I started in Guarujá. It's the only person I knew. It was Michael Carroll, Dottie's brother. And so he started taking me around the city, and then he set me off. This is a little picture. I said, Mike, stop the car. I need to take a picture of this. And eventually I settled down, because when I arrived, I just felt like all of the landscape and all of the architecture was so wacky that I kind of got like shutter happy and just started clicking everything. But then a few days later, I went to Sao Paulo, and I dove into kind of investigating what the identity of Sao Paulo was. And so I started to extract principles. That was kind of my method of research. I knew that if I saw a beautiful space, of course I wouldn't forget it, but if I started to compile and extract principles based on these spaces, it might be more relevant to me as an architect in Los Angeles. And so a lot of the pages of my sketchbooks just have to do with these little vignettes and these little diagrams that start to extract different principles from each of the different cities. And so again, here Sao Paulo really has a difference, has a strange contrast between this economic giant and then some of the Sao Paulo, the Paulista school of architects. Paulo Mendes de Rocha was one of the leading architects that I really started to admire. This is a project, it's called the Museu de Escultura, the Sculpture Museum, and it really embodies so many of the qualities of his work that I found captivating. It's these heroic spans and these large outdoor spaces that are very multi-use, and many days I would come here and there would be to draw, and there would be festivals here, and that really started to define the way I perceived my first taste of Brazilian architecture. So, you know, I'm not an artist. I draw just to see and try to understand these things, and so a lot of these sketches aren't particularly perfectly accurate, but again, I'll just repeat that my intention was to try to extract something that I can learn from it, extract somewhat of an idea. These are all just raw, torn right from my sketchbook. This is another De Rocha project. It's a canopy over a subway. This was something that fascinated me, again, to see this language of these outdoor canopies and the people bustling under. And so the subway station would just go right beneath that. And he had this big metal frame that framed this plaza courtyard space. Another building of his that was very interesting was this. It was called the Pinacoteca, the state museum, basically, and it held a very interesting collision of a historic building and then these soaring bridges that flew through the building. And so that was again another principle that I started to see repeated and became one of my favorite spaces. I spent a lot of time at the School of Architecture in Sao Paulo, the FAU, and it's an amazing building because ramps connect all the floors, but then there's no vertical division. There's basically no walls, so anybody from anywhere can walk completely through this building and up into it. That was by, let's see, João Batista Villanova Artigas, also a Paulista architect. I visited several projects by Rui Otaki, and he had lots of really wacky exhibits, big open spaces. And then I discovered Lina Bobardi, or they say Lina Bobardi. And again, we have these soaring, heroic spans, giant concrete volumes. And what's so interesting to me about the space was the way that the people collected under it. And it's officially the protest space. So every day there would be different protests and different basically events happening beneath what was a museum. And so this was just a sketch as I was just kind of freehanding the proportions of this space and whether that had anything to do with it. And this is just a drawing of what's in between the ceiling of that building or the underbelly of that building and the floor and all the different people. And there's a few shots here of these school kids. They would just run around, and it was very interesting to see the sidewalk all of a sudden be released into this space. And so up in the top there's some more vignettes of the way the staircase picks up and lifts up the sidewalk into the underbelly of this beastly building. This is the Sesc Pompeia, also by Lina Bobardi. Again, the Paulista School of Architects, they were really into the raw, soaring concrete. And so, I mean, to me, this was just fascinating to see these crisscrossing bridges that start to activate the space beneath. And it was inserted, these concrete structures were inserted into a refrigeration factory, and it was turned into kind of a cultural center. So you have pottery, you have printmaking, you have chess, and all these different activities happening in these spaces. Some more shots, some more vignettes from the sketchbook, trying to understand the way it worked. And then in Sao Paulo, that's where I got my first kind of taste of Niemeyer and just the wackiness of this concrete, the plastic concrete, and which would really come about more in Rio. I'd really discover that in Rio and Brasilia the most. It doesn't look like concrete, it's crazy. But this is an entrance to a theater. And of course, this circulation that these architects deployed was fascinating. The way that ramps would lead you to everything. Sometimes you were either completely free to walk anywhere you want under these giant canopies, or the ramp would lead you exactly. There just seemed to be no in between. And so then Rio, it's this powerful collision, like I said, of landscape and architecture. And the landscape is so dominant that these towers, they seem tiny. You have these bullet-shaped rock formations that shoot up out of the water, and it really provides a remarkable contrast in the city. This is just a little diagram about how the development of the city was very linear, but it always had to basically improvise around these mountains. And so that was another principle that I started to understand, was this interesting dialogue between what could be called Brazilian modernism, which we all know about, and then also the Brazilian improvisation, and those two things working either against each other or hand in hand sometimes. And so this is a shot of the Niterói Museum by Niemeyer. Again, you have this winding serpentine ramp, like the 105 freeway leading right up into the Getty Center sort of thing. It's quite remarkable. And then beneath it, you just circulate all around it. And so again, you might look at the sketch and think, well, that's kind of ugly. But for me, it was just about extracting these ideas about the way that the landscape is always 24/7 in the background behind this architecture, and how this idea of circulation and the idea of movement played a very important role. And so here you see this freeway just thrusting right into the mouth of this museum. And so, of course, just a lot of little vignettes trying to understand the way the peninsula, the coastline in Brazil isn't like it is here. You don't have a north and south. Nobody really knows north and south at all, it seemed, because it's so windy. And so these serpentine white sculptures and these bullet-shaped mountains had quite an impact together. It wasn't the sort of the Roman grid I had seen before in Europe. This is just a sketch, the mountains and the clouds and some of the iconic things. And so there was one building in Sao Paulo in Rio that really felt like it should be in Sao Paulo. It was this big concrete cathedral. And the reason I show this, and what I found so relevant about this, is it was like an inverse monument. From the outside, it looks like this gritty concrete structure, but from the inside, it was really this monument of space. And the only thing I could have compared it to that I've seen was the Pantheon. And again, it was just this deployment of this heroically spanning concrete. Some shots. It was really beautiful. In Rio, they would tell me, in LA they tell you don't carry anything too valuable in South Central, but in Rio they tell you always have something to give when you get robbed. And so often I went days without my camera because I had to just lock it up in some parts of downtown, and so I would have to draw myself maps in my sketchbook to get around, and it really gave me an idea. I mean, sketchbooking, I feel like it leaves so much room for incompleteness and for process and for an understanding, and so it was just 24/7 with me. And again, I never thought I would be showing it to 75 people, so I didn't care that my hand was shaky and all those things, but it was really for me this process of starting to understand these cities. Then when I had my camera, I would snap like crazy. This is a project also in Rio. It's kind of the main downtown museum. And again, I was like, how did I not know about this? Again, you have this huge spanning space. I knew about pilotis and about the 5 points of architecture and about the roof garden and the ground seamlessly soaring under the building, but I didn't know I'd find it everywhere. And so again, sometimes there would be concerts, sometimes there would be marketplaces, sometimes there would be musical events, but these giant soaring concrete volumes became something that I really started to identify as being part of the language. You'll see, I think we've got some more staircases coming up, but then, of course, I saw some of the most beautiful staircases I've ever seen. Just this idea that from the ground floor, you're picked up into the underbelly of these buildings. Here's some shots of Rio. You've all seen the postcards, but this is the background to which all of the architecture stands, and you have this what's now a hotel in the upper right, and it was just incredible. And so the interview with Oscar Niemeyer came about very randomly, but for me it was one of the highlights of the trip because I've been studying his work for so long, and I've just been dying to ask him some questions and to see what he was like in person. As you can imagine, as an architecture student, it was kind of a big deal for me. I don't know. I was super stoked. This is a view of his office overlooking Copacabana Beach. And basically, I went to his house, which is a museum, and I was the only person there. There was a gardener, and I asked the gardener, "Do you have Oscar Niemeyer's number?" And he laughed at me and rattled off about 9 digits. And when I got home, I met a Portuguese guy. I said, "Can you call this number for me? I think it's Oscar Niemeyer's phone number." Called it. The wife answers the phone, and she says, "No way, you can't come over, we don't do that." So I called again the next day, and she said, "Come now." And so I got in a taxi, and I spent 2 hours, and on the way I picked up a guy who was from the National Geographic, and he spoke English and Portuguese, so we jumped in, and he's the one who took the photos and helped me have a conversation with it was just amazing. It was a highlight of my trip. And so what did he talk about, of course? He talked about football, he talked about women, he talked about curves. But he also talked about something I found very interesting. He talked about the acceleration of aging in certain monuments of architecture. And he talked about how his architecture ages faster than he does. He just celebrated his 101st birthday, so John, you have 50 years to go. You got a long way. But he, it was this interesting idea that he was describing about how his architecture is not old, but it's become old because, Oscar Niemeyer, he was a child of his age. He engaged his contemporaries, and so the timeliness of his architecture dates it to a point where it's become a period in time. And it was just fascinating for me to have that conversation with him. He also talked a lot about the developments in Rio versus the developments in Brasilia. He talked a lot about landscape, and so I show these shots of Burle Marx, the Burle Marx Institute, and it's so fascinating the way that this landscape architect uses these stones which came off of towers that were demolished in downtown to build these structures in the garden. And again, you have these large open spaces. And on the bottom, the canopy, that was a kind of a school of design, a school of architecture. And so again, the climate is so wonderful. Sometimes it rains, but it's so wonderful that so much of the cultural activities happen outdoors. And it just reminded me, I was reading a publication by Journey Partners, and John was talking about what's the boundary between landscape and architecture. And the answer, there is none. And so here, it really exemplifies that to me. It was exciting to see this fluidness of space. And so, of course, Rio, some of the iconic shots. Of course, Lucio Costa, I show this here because Oscar, he talked a lot about the development in Brazil. He talked a lot about how fast the city happened and how he would draw something one day, the next day it would be built. And it reminded me of the stories my dean would share with us, Dean Ma, about in China and in Asia, you draw something and the next day it's already being built, and the speed at which construction happens. And it was really exciting to have these sort of conversations. He talked a lot about the diagrams and the planning with which Brasilia happened. And I didn't know where to put this shot, but I know if you guys are this close to the beach, there has to be some surfers. The waves in Rio were unreal, and so we're done with Rio. We're going inland. This is Brasilia. The modern city. It's very utopian. It's got these giant white sculptures, all by Niemeyer, planned by Lucio Costa. And I was excited to check it out, especially after just having spoken with Niemeyer. And it's really kind of a fantasy land of enormous highways and then giant sculptures of architecture that are quite scaleless when you look at them. I mean, that could be a salad bowl, or that could be, 50 feet tall. And so these are, of course, on the right, that's a shot of all of the ministeries. And so there's 10 ministeries on every side. It's where the government buildings happen. And what I found interesting about this facade is there's a lot of different types of brise soleil that I found, and you get these really interesting color patterns just by adjusting the louvers. And so the way that this airplane plan of Brasilia was laid out, every building that, every facade and all the buildings that face in this direction here have these really interesting louvers that provide lots of different colors, or shades of colors. It was really interesting for me to see this collaboration, not just a collision between landscape and architecture, but here you have Burle Marx, a landscape architect, collaborating with Oscar Niemeyer. And so almost every single one of these buildings had these fantastic interior gardens, where from the outside it wouldn't look like it was open, but from the inside it would just open up often into, I'll just go back, often into these outdoor spaces. And so this is one of my favorite buildings. It's the Itamaraty Palace. And so it was, again, a collaboration between an artist, Arthur Bucon, and Burle Marx, the landscape architect, and then Oscar Niemeyer, the architect. This shot, first I did the sketch because I took a tour and they told me, you can't stand there too long. I said, well, then how long can I stand here? And they said, well, you got let's say 5 minutes. So I did a sketch. And then that night I went to a concert and I met a Brazilian woman who works for the government, and then she gave me a private tour of all the buildings, and I got to take all the photos I wanted. Wow. So the sketches came first. I kind of have this pet peeve against drawings and photos. Yeah, just beautiful. The sunsets in Brasilia are, I know this is a sunset, I don't think I have a picture of it, but the sun is so warm, and these white forms, I call them white, they are white, but so often they're these brilliant golds. And so this is a layout of the city. This is a photo on top of a sketchbook, and so you can see the fuselage of the airplane plan. Right down the middle, they call it the Eixo Monumental, and so along there you have all of these giant white modernist buildings, and then on the axis, what looks like it's going east and west, it's almost east and west, is are all of the quadras. It's the neighborhoods where the people live. And so lots and lots of just trying to jot down as I'm running around the city all the ideas. Landmark of modernity, a monument that synthesizes the union of lightness and largeness of our horizons. And so everything had to be so heroic and so timely. It's a museum. The one that's up, the bowl that's rounded at the top is a museum, and then you have the Senate. It's the bowl that looks like it's standing as a bowl normally would. This is interesting because I had heard so many times that in Brasilia it's not a pedestrian city. You can't walk around, you can only drive. It doesn't make sense for a pedestrian. And at first I thought, oh, they're so right. But then when I met that girl who took me everywhere, I realized that there's these underground tunnels that connect everybody. And so as long as you work for the government, it's completely pedestrian. So you just zip back and forth between these bowls and then pop up into the bubbles. And it's something that I missed when I was studying in the textbooks. Went to the forest. This is Hado. It's a type of forest that's both wet and dry at the same time, and lots of color in Brazil. This is on the campus the one on the left is on the campus in Brasilia, and the one on the right is the theater designed by Niemeyer. And again, just these serpentines floating, sometimes floating, concrete staircases. You find them everywhere. This is really interesting. These are some of the buildings on the campus, and you can see how you just walk in from the outdoors. The garden's on the inside, the landscape's in the middle, the sidewalk becomes the stage. Everything is so integrated, and the air is it passes through everything. And so often there wasn't even a need for glazing. And I don't know, something about this seemed relevant for me as, you know, I hope to become a Los Angeles architect one day, and the climate here is spectacular, and it was so inspiring to see this connection of space like that. This is the main building on campus, a very, very long building. It just keeps going. You get more students, just add a few more cells. So I had, after I was done with Brasilia, I had a few more days left, and my younger brother just graduated from the fire academy and became a paramedic. So he's like, Anthony, I'm coming. I thought, okay, well, you know, what are we going to do? So we traveled around some different smaller cities, and I got to bore him to death as I was pointing out, look, Dave, there's a dialogue between architecture and landscape, and he was like, okay, well, it looks interesting. And so we visited a lot of wacky spots, and then I went back to Guarujá, and we had a few days left, and I had seen so much architecture, but you know, something that I did not expect happened. I had some money left over because basically so many people, so many strangers opened their homes for me and let me stay with them, and so many people drove me from city to city that I had money left over. But not just that, the dollar doubled in value in South America, and so I had more money. And so anyways, it wasn't that much money. I mean, it was, for me, for a broke college student, I was just expecting to have to pay more loans. But the traveling fellowship went all the way to the end, which was great. But the last story I want to tell is just something a little more humble. I interacted with a large, no, not a large, many people from this church in Guarujá, and they, I saw them a few times, and they were in Sao Paulo a few times. Anyways, they, when I came back, the church had grown so much that people were sitting outside. And I thought, oh, that's so Brazilian, you know, they sit outside the windows, and the church service is happening indoors. That's very interesting. And I guess what I've learned is they had been praying for a new structure, a new like roof canopy sort of thing. And I was like, oh, that's so Brazilian, that's so cool, you know, that's awesome. And you know, there's this outdoor space where they would sit outside the windows, and they would look into the church, and they would have hair cutting sessions and music things, and they would have, the schools would bring the kids here for things. And so it's this multi-purpose outdoor space, completely in line with everything that I had seen even at the museums. It's just this multicultural outdoor space, but they didn't have a roof to it yet. And so me and my brother sitting there, we're like, you want to build a roof? And we're like, all right, let's build a roof. You know, we have 6 days, and you know, is it possible? And so you know, basically we had no tools, we had nothing except a lot of people who were eager to help. There was no professional on site, but I witnessed kind of what I would call just a miniature miracle, where people started hearing this rumor, oh, a roof's going to be built, a roof. So people from the city started kind of collecting and bringing tools and bringing wood and all this stuff. And the little bit of money that I had left, we were able to buy some of the important pieces of wood. And, you know, these people, they would say, okay, well, you know, let's just pray for it. I don't know what spiritual background you guys come from, but, you know, even me growing up in the church, it was kind of strange to hear, like, let's pray for wood. And I mean, again, like, no, I'm a Christian. I do pray, but it was a new thing for me to like pray like that. But the miracle was that wood started showing up, and like, I'm not kidding. We didn't have even a hammer, okay? And so like, it just started coming, and me and my brother were like, well, we have 4 days left. I don't know, is it going to happen? Like, we're willing. So, as an architect, I was able to do a quick design, and so I'm sketching out what some of the ideas might be, and anyways, so it's all improv though. They don't want to plan, they just want to do it, and they wanted to, so it was kind of, for me, this wacky collision again of the Brazilian improvisation and the Brazilian modernism, and so we just started going. We just started building this thing, and again, like, you'll have to take my word for it, but I got a quote about how much the wood would cost. I was just like, I want to see how much it would cost to see how much money I have. The quote was 6 times higher than the amount of money I had, right? I told the pastor how much money I had, and the guy from the hardwood store came out and said, this is how much it would cost, and it was the exact number that I had. And so I literally shelled out everything. I said, okay, you're going to have to pay for my food for the next 4 days. And my brother and I ate there and slept there, and we built a roof. And I mean, it was, I don't know, for me, there was nothing like studying the architecture, getting my hands dirty. I know you are all architects who have many buildings built, and Journey Partnership has thousands of buildings across the globe. I don't. This was my first building in Brazil. It was very humble, but there was a lot of love that went into it. And so it was something very special. I want to thank John and Janice for providing this fellowship, because it provides a diversity of education that is so unmatched in the classroom. It provides an opportunity for discovery that is so unmatched. Even at one of the best, some of these best architecture schools, there was no other learning experience that I've had that you could have this kind of improvisation, this kind of discovery, and this much unexpected blessing. And so for me, it was this collision of all aspects of life together with... these people were in tears. They couldn't believe they had this thing. Because in Brazil, basically, there's 2 seasons. There's rain and there's dry. And so the rain was coming. It was raining in every city around us, not in Guarujá at that time. And so we were just racing against the clock, and the day it was done, I left, and then I got these photos when I arrived in Houston, and they were already having another party. so anyways, what I hope you found something relevant within this presentation. Again, it's just some of it's personal, some of it overlaps with your profession. My closing thought is, I don't want to sound like a travel agent or something, but like life really collides when you get to travel the world. And I've heard that for John, traveling was very important to him as a development of an architect, and I believed it, but now I know it, and it's just so encouraging for me to see so many international faces here, and to know that, like, these are the backgrounds that we have. And maybe you might think that church isn't relevant or a perfect wave isn't relevant. But I really think it's making me a better architect, to understand the collision of all these things. And John, I know I've read about placemaking and the way that people and events can start to define these spaces. And so I got my first taste. So anyways, thanks a lot.